Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take an in-depth technical look at the newly released PlayStation 4 port of Rockstar's beloved open-world classic Red Dead Redemption, and see how it stacks up to the original release of the game on the PlayStation 3. For this analysis, the original version of the game is being played on an original PlayStation 3 console, with no hardware or software modifications made. The new PS4 version of the game, however, will actually be played on the PlayStation 5, as this allows the game to run at a full 4K resolution via backwards compatibility, allowing for the absolute best visual presentation on PlayStation's family of console hardware. Now, before we get started, it's important to note that Red Dead Redemption has already been fully playable on the newer Xbox consoles as well, which, thanks to their backwards compatibility support, has allowed players who own an original copy of the game to enjoy a seamlessly improved experience without having to buy the game a second time. Unfortunately, due to how Sony has handled backwards compatibility with its PlayStation 3 titles, this option has not been made available to PlayStation gamers. And therefore, even if you own the original game on PS3, digital or otherwise, this new release will still run you about $50 US to play on PS4 or PS5. So now let's take a look at what's actually been changed with this latest release, starting with the general image quality. Now, the first thing you'll probably notice when viewing these two side by side is just how drastically the image clarity has been improved with this latest release. For those that didn't already know, the original PS3 version of Red Dead runs at a sub-HD resolution of about 1152 by 640. The image then uses an old form of anti-aliasing called quincunx, that manages to smooth over some of the more egregious jagged edges, while also adding a blurry filter over top of the presentation. The cutscenes, thankfully, don't suffer quite as much from this, with plenty of detail and nice, albeit very dated animation work, delivering the game's excellent narrative. Though, when propped up next to the newly released PS4 version, we immediately see the benefits of that 4K resolution. Characters appear almost perfectly crisp, with even the smaller strands of hair being smoothed out, with very few visible jagged edges at a normal viewing distance. This is then assisted further by the addition of AMD's FSR 2.0, that is used to greatly improve anti-aliasing in the game without any form of upscaling that's typically associated with the feature. Because of this, the PS5 version of Red Dead Redemption manages to look visually superior to even the backwards compatible Xbox version of the game running on the newest Xbox console, albeit by a very small amount. And for PlayStation-only gamers, this visual update from the old PS3 version is night and day. However, that's pretty much where all the praise for this release ends, because outside of that native 4K resolution and the much smoother 30 FPS lock, very little else has been done to actually improve this game's visuals. Take the character models for example. While we can certainly see John's face more clearly here, the actual model complexity, texture quality, and poly count have not been altered in any discernible way. You can expect to see lots of those sharp edges to characters' jaw lines that have more or less disappeared from more modern releases, dating the game quite a bit. Animation work, like those in the cutscenes and the excellent Euphoria-based ragdolls, all remain intact, and they do still look as impressive as I remember them being. Though the clunky movement, especially character rotation and precision aiming, hasn't aged very well. However, considering this is just a port, this is to be expected. Thanks to the power of the newer hardware, Red Dead Redemption on the PS4 and PS5 can now draw significantly more detail in its beautiful open-world environment, with a massive increase to the vegetation density, LOD, and draw distance that help make large vistas like this one significantly more impressive. Texture quality up close hasn't changed much at all, with what looks like identical texture maps that only appear a bit sharper thanks to the removal of that old blurry AA method. But more detailed scenes like the main street of Armadillo look more crisp and clean this time around, especially when viewing finer details like the telephone lines that previously suffered a great deal. Lighting has also seen a few interesting changes, many of which seem to indicate that the version of Red Dead Redemption that we're actually playing here isn't a port of the PS3 version at all, but rather the original Xbox 360 code, as many of that version's unusual visual issues regarding lighting like the missing window shadows in the saloon in this intro scene, and the train station's ambient lighting are either missing or changed slightly, despite an identical time of day. Even the train's light rays that incorrectly displayed an ugly cone on the PS3 are now displaying just as they did on the Xbox 360. This would make sense, as the old PS3 code likely wouldn't have translated as well over to the newer PS4 and PS5 architecture, mainly due to how it handled its cell processor framework. Though it's still fascinating that missing internal lights like these are still, after all these years, not being rendered properly with this particular code. But this is only a minor issue, and overall, the newer PS4 and PS5 version of the game renders lighting much better than the old PS3 version ever did, allowing light to more realistically cast through tree leaves and not flicker all over the place with weird flashing alpha effects. The shadows have been touched up a good amount too, with much sharper shadows across the board, replacing the ugly mess of pixels that we saw before. There's a few instances where the softer shadows used in the old PS3 version seem to appear more natural, like those shadows cast by taller objects that now inexplicably cast incredibly sharp projections on the ground. But the increased shadow draw distance, coupled with the sharper shadow detail in dense urban environments, more than makes up for this. Effects are another area that aren't technically improved so much as they are being carried over from the old 360 version that looked better to begin with. The surface of the water in the intro, for example, never looked good on the PS3, but now appears properly with this new release. And smokestacks, seen in sequences like this one, are much more detailed than before. But the other effects like fire, explosions, physics, and other destructive elements to dynamic objects all remain roughly the same. What's nice about this release, though, is that PlayStation gamers can finally enjoy all of Red Dead Redemption's bombastic Western action with a nice locked frame rate that, unlike the old PS3 version, won't get bogged down in areas like Thieves Landing. After about 4 hours of gameplay, I never once experienced anything even remotely resembling the types of insane performance slowdowns on offer on the old PS3 release, making the gameplay feel much tighter and more consistent as a result. It's definitely a huge shame that this version couldn't come with the much needed 60 FPS update, especially when considering we've seen the game running at these frame rates via emulators for quite some time. But the 30 FPS is at least solid, and has never felt better on an actual PlayStation console. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Because this is essentially a straight port, we shouldn't expect too many differences here, but this will at least give you a chance to view some of the footage that I've captured and spot any differences on your own. So, which version do you think looks and sounds the best? And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Red Dead Redemption on the PlayStation 4, or rather the PlayStation 5 in this case, is the perfect example of too little, way too late. There's really nothing here to justify the remarkably steep $50 price point, especially when considering a nearly identical version has been available for competing consoles for years now, and has not required legacy players to buy the game a second time. The game itself does play great, just like it did all those years ago. And if you did miss out way back when and have been itching to finally experience John Marston's adventures following the story of Red Dead Redemption 2, then this is the perfect opportunity, and in my opinion, is still worth the price for newcomers, even today. But it's worth noting that this version is also missing some of its features, especially its online multiplayer component, despite still crediting its creators in the game's opening sequence. My guess is that the online multiplayer for the original releases is probably reaching the end of its lifetime, and will soon be shut down, and it's unlikely Rockstar would want to revive interest in something like that, only for it to get shut down a few years later. Though it certainly would have been nice to see some of that content like the gang hideouts reintroduced in some form for players to enjoy offline. On the bright side, this release of the game does also come with the extremely good Undead Nightmare expansion, which back then cost gamers an extra $10 on top of the initial $60 price. Though it's understandably still not the best price for a decade-old game that's had the bare minimum done to it. Even the UI elements like menus and the game's crosshair are stuck rendering at 720p still, which looks especially bad when placed next to the few new UI prompts that were added to match up with the PS4 button icons. Basically, if you like Red Dead Redemption and want to replay it, this is technically the best version of the game so far. But the missing features, low-effort updates, and incredibly steep price point should at least be considered strongly beforehand. But what do you guys think? Do you think Red Dead Redemption on the PS4 is worth double dipping for to get that 4K resolution? Or were you expecting more? Let me know in the comments section. And be sure to stay tuned to this channel for my upcoming project on the Red Dead series, set to release soon. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.